This is a Varsity podcast.
For more information, visit varsity.co.uk.
To dissent is to differ in sentiment or opinion, especially from the majority, or to withhold assent or to disagree. When people talk of dissent, it often conjures up pictures of rioting, burning cars, pepper spray, police on horseback, protesters, of the Arab Spring, the students attacking Millbank, the August riots that tore through Britain. But to me, the most powerful forms of dissent aren't necessarily the ones that shout or scream the loudest. In fact, sometimes the greatest are those that are nothing more than a whisper. The greatest acts of dissent are those by those who are oppressed by not only institutions, but by their families and communities too. So when thinking of what area of dissent I consider the strongest and most powerful, I thought of some of the most basic forms of discrimination and of the most basic human rights that are deprived. The most obvious injustice is the prevention of access for women to education. Such a basic right that is denied to millions of women worldwide, either forcibly by discriminative governments or by lack of facilities or access, is one of the greatest problems of our time. Education for all is seen as so important that it is enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 26 states that everyone has the right to education. And even though to us it is such a basic right, it is continually denied to many, especially in the developing world, and especially to women. This is certainly nothing new, and is unfortunately still both common and widespread. But many women have stood up for not only themselves, not only for women, but for their nations, and key to this is their education, which is begged for and borrowed for. This landlocked area of Asia has been war-torn for more than a century. Little respite between imperial attacks, Soviet invasion, civil war, and now the Taliban insurgents. Amongst the chaos, women's rights have been suppressed further and further, but not all were prepared to go down without a fight. Called by the BBC Afghanistan's clandestine army, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan was founded in 1977 by a female student called Meena Keshwar Kamal. Meena began the organisation after leaving Kabul University to devote her time to social activism and founded Rawa to give a voice to the women of Afghanistan. After the Soviet takeover in 1979, Meena rallied the organisation against the Russian regime, organising protests and open meetings to muster public opinion. Rawa, however, wanted it to be clear that although they were against the Soviet occupation, this did not mean that they were on the side of fundamentalist freedom fighters. On the contrary, Rawa campaigned for a secular and democratic state of Afghanistan. The organisation did not take up arms, but aimed to help those affected by the war, working in refugee camps and setting up schools and hospitals in Qatar, across the border in Pakistan. Rawa soon became threatened, targeted by fundamentalists for their secularism and by the secret police for stirring up opposition. This reached a climax when Meena was assassinated in 1987, and to this very day the identities of her killers are still unknown. 2 years after her death, the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, but the country was now torn apart by civil war as militias fought for territory and power, until in 1996 a government was put in place by the Islamic fundamentalist militia, the Taliban. Whilst once Afghan women could dress to their liking, Taliban doctrine forced them under the veil. The increasing intensity of reinforced Sharia law took it further still. If a woman fell and accidentally showed her bare ankle, she could be arrested. Even riding a bicycle was seen as a crime, and women have been known to have their fingers cut off simply for wearing nail varnish. Under the Taliban, not only was a woman's image controlled, but the Taliban attempted to control their ideas, forbidding them from education and employment, forcing widows to beg on the street. The US removed the Taliban regime in October 2001, a month after 9/11, but the government that was introduced was still corrupt, and as the Taliban still holds control over areas of the country, a new government did not necessarily mean a better way of life. However, the women of Afghanistan continued to fight for their freedom through modest acts of dissent. Rawa continued through the Taliban's regime and is still working today, publishing the reality of life as an Afghan woman in their bilingual magazine Payam Mizan, meaning Woman's Message, founded by Meena in 1981. In the winter of 2003, the Loya Jirga, the Afghan government, gathered together to discuss a new constitution and to decide how the country would be run. A young female delegate from a western province asked for permission to speak, claiming that the opinions of the younger members were not being listened to. The chairman allowed her 3 minutes to speak, and in that small time she shook a nation. Malalai Joya began respectfully describing her feelings towards the country's situation, but then went on to object to the presence of war criminals at the meeting, members of the Mujahideen who under jihad were being held as heroes. Malalai's words were met with approval from many, but with death threats from others. Removed from the assembly, this was the beginning of Malalai's fight for democracy. Overnight, she became the most famous woman in Afghanistan. As a child, Malala had managed to forge an education for herself in the refugee camps of Iran and Pakistan, and in her teens she was enlisted by an NGO to return to Afghanistan to work in secret as a teacher. Afghanistan had changed and was now in the power of the Taliban regime. Malala, however, was not a woman to be subdued or controlled. She worked in Farah teaching girls in secret in people's basements, and as the organisation was so impressed by her fortitude, they appointed her director of the Harris and Farah branch of the NGO. Still disgusted at the way her country was being run, she decided to get involved in politics. After the incident at the lawyer Jirga, Malala became the target of many assassination attempts, but this did not deter her passion for liberation, and she went on to run for parliament and won by a landslide. Now an official member of government, she was determined to cure Afghanistan and reduce the corruption leading it. However, her continued defiance against the warlords led to a terrible turn of events. They decided to vote her out of parliament, and President Karzai allowed it. Malala was not one to be silenced. Although continuously forced into hiding and requiring bodyguards on a 24-hour basis, she continues to work to help women in Afghanistan. She has gained strong media attention, appearing in international newspapers and news channels, explaining the reality of life in Afghanistan, in her own words, trapped between two enemies, the Taliban and NATO, both of which have killed hundreds of innocent Afghans. As can be clearly seen through the stories of Meena and Malala, their perseverance for education not only allowed them to fulfill their potential, but also made lasting imprints on their nation. They have been true leaders not just of human rights, but of liberation. There are countless more stories of such heroines, and many young girls continue to fight for their rights to be educated. Female education is not only important for women, it is also now recognised as the single most important factor in the reduction of infant mortality rates. If a woman is educated, she is more likely to be healthy, to have healthier children, and to be more independent. She will also usually marry later and have fewer children. An educated mother is also more likely to educate her children than a similarly educated father. So from a completely social and economic stance, it is to every nation's benefit to educate women, as it increases GNP per capita, reduces health problems, and reduces population growth, an issue still fresh in our minds after passing the 7 billion global population mark only last year. Theresa Billerton-Gray described the restriction of women in her 1907 essay Women's Liberty and Man's Fear through a simple fable. Two children are about to run a race. Says one to the other, "You cannot run so well as I can, so I will bind your legs with a cord." Then as the race proceeds, he cries, you can't run, I'm clever and stronger than you are." "Unbind my legs," is the answer, "that I may have a chance." But the free-limbed child capers about and says, "Unbind you? No, indeed. You have not come as far as I have. You do not know how to run, but when you catch me, I will unbind your legs." Our television screens over the past year have been filled with dissent, as hundreds and thousands of people have taken to the street to stand up for what they believe in. Whether it's through occupying public landmarks or through protestation, the world has appeared to be ringing with dissent as people roar for justice. But dissent is also coursing through our world system in the quieter acts of defiance of countless women as they fight for their right to an education and the rights of their people. Until women are fully unbound, fully enfranchised, and fully educated, both social and economic development will continue to be stunted and discrimination will continue to prevail. It is only through the continued bravery and dissenting acts of these women that equality will ever be achieved.